The first breath of winter. The medieval year was a cycle of survival, measured not by calendars hanging on walls but by the turn of the seasons, by the strength of harvests, by the length of the shadows at dusk. And of all the seasons, winter was the hardest, the truest test of human endurance. Imagine the moment when autumn's golden fields grew bare. The harvest, so precious, so fragile, was gathered, threshed, and stored in barns. Villagers prayed the yield would be enough, for they knew that once the first frost struck, the land would fall silent. From November onward, the earth gave nothing. The only food that sustained life was what had already been pulled from the soil, slaughtered from the pen, or salted in barrels. As the days shortened, fear grew quietly in every heart. They did not fear snow alone, but hunger, sickness, and the bitter cold that stole breath from lungs. The wealthy in castles with stone walls and storerooms full of salted meats fared better, though even they shivered when fires grew low. For peasants in their timber cottages thatched with straw, survival was never certain. The first breath of winter arrived suddenly. A wind that cut deeper, a night frost that spread white lace across windows of horn or parchment. Fires, once left to smolder lazily, now roared each evening as families huddled close. Men chopped wood feverishly, for every log meant warmth. Every log meant life. The cottage in winter step into a peasant's cottage in December. The room is low-ceilinged, the air thick with smoke from a central hearth. Walls of wattle and daub keep out some of the wind, but drafts creep through gaps. The floor is earthen, covered in straw that grows damp with snow trampled in from boots. At the heart burns the fire, glowing orange, spitting sparks, the one source of comfort in the long night. Children gather near it, wrapped in rough wool, their cheeks red from cold. A pot of pottage, thick stew of beans, cabbage, and whatever scraps remain, bubbles slowly. The smell of onions and turnips lingers, filling the air with a meager but precious promise of food. Above the fire, meat sometimes hangs, if fortune allowed a pig to be slaughtered before Christmas. More often, dried fish or hard cheese rests on shelves, guarded carefully against rats. Every crumb, every bite is weighed. Food must last until March, perhaps April, when the earth might yield again. The weight of darkness. The hardest thing to endure was not always hunger, nor even cold, but the darkness. In medieval winters, daylight was brief. The sun rose late, set early, leaving most of life in shadow. By 4 in the afternoon, the world was black again. Candles of tallow or beeswax were precious, often saved for special occasions. For peasants, light came only from fire. Outside, the land fell silent, blanketed in snow and mystery. Darkness bred fear. Wolves roamed the edges of villages, their howls carried across frozen fields. Stories whispered of spirits that prowled in winter nights, souls of the dead, demons of the cold, witches that moved with storms. For children, every creak of timber in the roof was a ghost. For adults, it was a reminder of fragility. Yet darkness also gave moments of closeness. Families shared tales by the hearth, their voices soft against the storm outside. A father carved tools, his knife tapping against wood. A mother spun thread, her spindle humming steadily. Children drifted to sleep as stories of saints, heroes, and ancient kings filled the smoky air. The Feast of St. Martin. Not all of winter was suffering. Before the cold deepened, peasants marked the feast of St. Martin in November, when animals were slaughtered. This was practical, not only pious. By then, fodder for livestock was scarce, and weaker animals would never last until spring. Their meat was salted, smoked, or dried, filling larders with what hope they could. For one night, the village feasted. Fires blazed. Ale flowed. Songs rose into the dark. Children ate until their bellies swelled, knowing tomorrow's meals would shrink again. This was the paradox of medieval life, moments of abundance quickly swallowed by months of want. The edge of survival. From the very first frost, survival was a calculation. How many loaves could be baked each week before flour ran low? How many turnips must be saved for the hunger gap of March? Could another blanket be patched from worn wool? Would the roof hold under snow? Each day was a step on a narrow path, with death waiting on either side, cold on one, hunger on the other. For peasants, survival was not guaranteed. It was a quiet victory earned with every breath in the frozen night. And so winter began, merciless, beautiful, and absolute. A season that tested every life, every home, every soul. The heart of the cold. By December, winter was no longer a visitor. It had taken its throne. The world outside lay frozen, a kingdom of ice and silence. The rivers that once carried trade and fish were now locked beneath glass. Fields, golden only weeks ago, stretched barren, white and endless. The wind sharpened like knives, cutting into flesh, turning every errand into hardship. In the villages, life shrank inward. The rhythm of survival revolved around the fire. To step outside was to face danger, of frostbite, of falling into hidden drifts, of being caught too far from warmth. Most journeys were postponed unless absolutely necessary. But sometimes necessity allowed no mercy. Wood had to be gathered, animals had to be tended, water had to be drawn from wells now rimmed with ice. The cold showed no favoritism. It entered both hut and castle. True, nobles fared better, cloaked in furs, drinking mulled wine from silver cups, sleeping on feather beds beneath heavy quilts. But even in their great halls, tapestries shivered against stone walls, and drafts slid across floors. Servants scurried endlessly to keep fires burning, for if they faltered, even the Lord's hearth would grow cold. The test of firewood. For peasants, wood was survival itself. Each log was a shield against the dark. Men rose before dawn, stomping through snow to gather fallen branches, hacking at frozen trunks with axes. The work was brutal. The bite of iron against wood, the crack of splinters, the numbing ache in hands. But wood could not be wasted. A single fire devoured it greedily. Families learned to bank flames carefully, covering embers with ash so they might smolder until morning. Children fetched kindling, breaking twigs with stiff fingers. Women stirred coals back to life, coaxing the faintest glow into roaring heat again. Villages that lacked woodland suffered most. In some places, peat was dug and dried, smoky but warming. In others, even dung was burned, pungent but better than freezing. The fire's warmth was never taken for granted. To sit beside it at night was a privilege, a moment of fragile comfort. The cold within the body. Winter seeped into bones. There was no escaping it. The layers of wool, the heavy cloaks, the straw mattresses, all dulled its edge but could not banish it entirely. To wake each morning was to feel the ache of cold lingering in joints, the stiffness of muscles that had frozen overnight. Children's cheeks were red and chapped, lips cracked, fingers split. Women rubbed lard or tallow into skin to keep it from bleeding. Men blew on hands before gripping tools, breath clouding the air in their own homes. Illness thrived in such conditions. Coughs became fevers. Fevers became funerals. With little medicine, survival often rested on luck, youth, or divine mercy. Families prayed not to lose children, not to bury parents. In winter, even the smallest illness could carry death. The watch against hunger. Every day, families measured their food. Granaries were checked, barrels lifted, cellars counted. Children begged for more, but mothers shook their heads gently. Too much eaten now meant starvation later. Rations were strict. Bowls were filled not with plenty but with just enough to keep the body working. Meals were repetitive. Pottage, bread, sometimes thin ale. Meat was rare. The salted pork slaughtered in November shrank steadily, slices growing smaller, bones reused again and again for broth. Vegetables, shriveled and stored, softened into stews. Cheese, once fresh, hardened to stone and was scraped carefully. The poor stretched food with desperation, boiling weeds, grinding acorns, even baking bread mixed with straw or sawdust when grain ran out. Each bite kept hunger at bay, but only just. The memory of autumn's feast faded quickly. Winter's hunger was relentless. The silence of the world. What made the season most haunting was its quiet. Snow muffled sound, turning villages into hushed landscapes. The fields lay still, the trees frozen in rigid poses, the rivers muted beneath ice. At night, the silence was broken only by the groan of timbers in the wind, or the distant howl of wolves. Sometimes, silence itself was a burden, pressing upon minds already weary. People filled it with prayer, with murmured songs, with whispered tales to children huddled beneath blankets. But sometimes they simply listened, to the crackle of fire, to the breathing of their families, to the stillness that surrounded them. Winter stripped away distraction, leaving only life and the will to preserve it. The strength of fellowship. And yet, even in such bleakness, humanity found light. Neighbors shared when they could, an extra loaf of bread, a portion of ale. Taverns flickered with laughter, even if cups were small. Songs rose from weary throats, defiant against the cold. Community was survival. Alone, one might falter. Together, they endured. A shared fire, a shared story, a shared prayer, these were the unseen weapons against winter's dominion. This was the heart of the cold, a season of testing, of suffering, but also of fellowship and faith. For in the depths of hardship, people discovered what truly bound them together. Not wealth, not power, but the stubborn, unyielding will to survive another day. The longest nights. By midwinter, the days had shrunk to their shortest. The sun rose weakly, a pale disk that gave little heat before vanishing again into the horizon. Darkness reigned for hours uncounted. The long nights seemed endless, stretching like a trial for both body and soul. In these nights, villagers huddled close to the fire, the only barrier between warmth and frostbite. Flames flickered across rough-hewn beams, casting long shadows that danced like spirits on the walls. For children, the shadows were both companions and terrors. monsters that crept closer when the fire grew low. Adults knew better, but even they felt unease. Darkness invited thoughts of wolves, of thieves, of things unseen beyond the door. The village watchman carried a torch, pacing slowly along frozen lanes. Each crunch of his boots was a reminder that danger lurked. Wolves prowled the edges of fields, their eyes shining like embers, their howls piercing the night. Sometimes they stole livestock. Sometimes they prowled away again, leaving only paw prints in the snow. But always they reminded people of fragility. Wolves and legends. To medieval minds, wolves were more than animals. They were omens, cursed creatures tied to fear and hunger. Folk tales whispered that wolves carried the souls of the restless dead. Some spoke of spectral hunts, packs led by ghostly riders sweeping through the night sky. In truth, wolves came because they too starved. Forests yielded little, deer fled, rabbits hid deep. And so the beasts crept toward villages, drawn by the scent of sheep, goats, even refuse piles near cottages. When wolves drew too close, villagers lit great bonfires, beating drums, clanging pots, driving them back into the forest. A man might stand guard with a spear, heart pounding as yellow eyes gleamed just beyond the light. Victory was not slaying the wolf. It was keeping it at bay until dawn. The hunger gap of midwinter. Descent carefully, measuring food to the smallest crumb. Hunger was no longer distant. It pressed on every belly. Children begged for seconds and were denied. Women stirred stews longer, hoping scraps might thicken into something more filling. Men chewed crusts tasted the bite of scarcity, though their tables still offered more than peasants could dream of. The hunger of midwinter was not starvation, yet, but it was gnawing, unrelenting, a daily reminder that months remained before harvest returned. Sickness in the cold. The body weakened in these conditions. Cold cramped muscles. Dampness seeped into bones. Coughs spread quickly in crowded cottages where air was heavy with smoke. With little medicine, families relied on herbs dried in summer, honey for sore throats, or prayers whispered to saints. When illness worsened, they had little choice but to endure. Too often, fevers claimed children or the elderly. A family might wake to find one less voice around the fire. Funerals in winter were bleak affairs. The ground was too frozen for digging, so graves were hacked through ice and stone. The tolling of church bells carried across snowy fields, a sound both mournful and ordinary, for death was no stranger to winter. The persistence of faith. Yet even in hardship, faith endured. Villagers crowded into churches, their breath rising in white clouds as they sang hymns. The cold bit at their feet as they knelt on stone floors, but the words of priests offered warmth. The calendar gave rhythm to endurance. The Feast of Epiphany, Candlemas, the small rituals that reminded people light would return, spring would come. These holy days were lanterns carried through the dark. Families prayed together at night, crossing themselves before bread, whispering blessings as they lay beneath blankets of wool and straw. For many, belief was the difference between despair and survival. The beauty in stillness. Though winter was cruel, it carried its own strange beauty. Moonlight painted fields silver. Snowflakes drifted like feathers, each one unique, fragile, dazzling before it melted in a palm. Icicles clung to eaves like crystal spears, glittering in the pale light. In the silence of night, a man might step outside and gaze upward, the stars sharp as diamonds against a black sky. For a moment, awe silenced hunger and fear. The world seemed vast, eternal, filled with mystery. This beauty did not erase hardship, but it reminded people that even in the coldest season, life was still threaded with wonder. The Midwinter Truth. By January's heart, every villager knew the truth. Winter was not something to conquer. It was something to endure. Each log of firewood burned was one less for tomorrow. Each loaf broken was one step closer to hunger. Each night survived was a victory in itself. And so they pressed on, day after day, night after night, enduring cold, hunger, fear, and silence, living not for comfort, but for the simple, stubborn act of survival. This was the longest night of the medieval year, not only in hours, but in spirit. And yet, even here, humanity's flame refused to die. Life inside the walls. As midwinter pressed harder, life became confined almost entirely to the indoors. Outside, the snow deepened and the air sliced skin like a blade. Paths between cottages narrowed into tunnels of white. The village seemed smaller, hushed, suspended, and so families turned inward, drawing closer, locked together by necessity. Inside the cottage, smoke curled from the central fire, darkening rafters and clinging to clothes. The single room was crowded. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, even livestock in the coldest nights. Chickens clucked softly in corners. A goat or calf slept on straw near the door, its body heat adding to the fragile warmth. Privacy was a luxury unknown. Survival demanded closeness. The space smelled of earth, wool, smoke, and stew. The sound of crackling fire was constant, interrupted by coughing, by the whir of spinning wheels, by the scrape of knives shaping wood. Days blurred in this dim cocoon, lit by firelight and, when fortunate, a flickering candle. The work of idle hands. Winter seemed like it might invite idleness, but idleness was dangerous. Hands that rested too long risked freezing. Minds that wandered too freely risked despair. So the season became one of quiet labor. Men carved tools, spoons, bowls, handles for axes that would be needed again when spring softened the earth. They mended shoes, patched harnesses, sharpened blades. Their knives moved in rhythm, each curl of wood a reminder that preparation never ended. Women spun wool, the spindle humming steadily, or wove cloth on looms that filled half the cottage. Their fingers turned fleece into thread, thread into garments, garments into protection. Every stitch was an act of foresight. Children were not idle either. Even the youngest gathered kindling, fed animals, twisted cords of straw for bedding, or practiced simple crafts. Play still existed, games with pebbles, bones, or carved dolls, but even play was woven into the rhythm of work. The battle against monotony. But no amount of work could fully banish the monotony. The same walls pressed in day after day. The same stew bubbled with the same ingredients. The same faces sat in the same circle of firelight. Restlessness crept in. Men longed for fields to plow, for sun on their backs. Women longed for gardens to tend, for fresh herbs to flavor meals. Children longed for space to run. Even laughter sometimes carried an edge of frustration. To fight this monotony, stories became vital. Elders told tales of kings and saints, of dragons slain, of winters survived in years past. Songs rose, soft lullabies for children, hymns of faith, even rough drinking songs that broke gloom with laughter. These were not luxuries, they were lifelines, weaving variety into days that otherwise blurred into one long night. The weight of close-quarters claustrophobia brought tension. Tempers flared easily. A snapped word, a careless elbow, an argument over food, all could ignite conflict when escape was impossible. Yet survival demanded restraint. To live through winter, family bonds had to hold. Mothers soothed quarrels with calm voices. Fathers kept silence when anger threatened. Children were hushed when cries grew too loud. Each person learned to carry small burdens for the sake of peace, for disharmony was as dangerous as hunger. Still, there was comfort in closeness too. To fall asleep to the sound of others' breathing, to feel a sibling's body beside your own under the same blanket, to wake to the murmur of parents whispering by the fire. These were the fragile threads that tied people to life. The flicker of festivals. Though the cold dragged endlessly, the church calendar brought sparks of light. Candlemas in early February saw candles blessed, flames lifted high in churches still frozen but full of hope. The light symbolized more than faith. It marked the turning of the season, a reminder that the worst might soon pass. Villages sometimes held small gatherings on these feast days. A little ale poured, a little bread shared, laughter breaking monotony for a night. The winter of the mind. Winter tested the body, yes, but even more, it tested the mind. Hunger, cold, and confinement gnawed at people's thoughts as surely as wolves gnawed bones. And in a world where explanations were scarce, imagination filled the gaps. The medieval winter was not only endured with firewood and food, it was endured with belief. The reign of darkness. Long nights brought unease. Darkness was not neutral. It was dangerous, a place where evil lurked unseen. Without lanterns or torches, the countryside was swallowed by blackness so deep it seemed alive. A man walking alone after sundown felt himself hunted by the unseen, whether wolves, spirits, or the devil himself. Families clung to firelight. The glowing hearth was more than warmth. It was a shield against the dark. When the fire dimmed, whispers grew louder. People feared that shadows carried more than shapes, they carried presence. Children were told not to stare too long into the night, lest something stare back. Omens in the snow superstition flourished in winter. Every strange sound, every unusual mark in the snow could be read as a sign. A crow circling above a frozen field might signal famine. A dog howling at night meant death was near. Footprints that appeared without explanation became proof of wandering spirits. The howls of wolves carried layers of meaning. They were not simply predators, they were messengers. To hear a wolf at the edge of the village might be taken as warning. Guard your home. Guard your soul. Dreams, too, became omens. A dream of fire was good fortune. It promised warmth and survival. A dream of falling through ice foretold sickness. Dreams were retold at the fire each morning, studied as carefully as scripture. The grip of fear. This atmosphere of superstition magnified every hardship. A bad harvest was not simply bad luck, it was divine punishment. An illness was not only a sickness, it was the touch of sin or witchcraft. When food ran low, some wondered if they had angered heaven. When storms raged, they whispered that demons rode the wind. Fear sharpened the cold. It pressed on the chest, made every knock at the door suspicious, every shadow a threat. And yet, paradoxically, fear bound communities together. Villagers prayed as one, clung to rituals, and trusted in the same saints and sacraments. Belief gave shape to fear, and in that shape, comfort. Faith as fire. In the heart of the cold, the church became the center of endurance. Its bells marked time, its candles pierced darkness, its words promised salvation beyond earthly misery. Priests preached that winter was a trial of faith. Just as Christ fasted in the desert, so too must Christians endure the hunger of the season. Suffering became not just punishment, but participation in a divine mystery. To survive was to prove devotion. Holy days broke monotony with light and music. The chanting of monks echoed in icy stone chapels. Processions wound through snow-covered streets, carrying icons, sprinkling holy water. Each ritual reminded people that they were not alone in their struggle, that heaven watched, that saints interceded. The threat of witchcraft. But not all beliefs comforted. In times of desperation, suspicion fell on neighbors. If cows stopped giving milk or a child wasted away, whispers turned to accusations. Perhaps someone had cursed them. Winter was especially fertile ground for such fears. With resources scarce, envy seemed more likely, curses more believable. A woman living alone might be watched carefully. Did her fire burn too bright? Did her animals thrive while others starved? The line between survival and sorcery was thin. Though great witch trials came later in history, suspicion lived even in the medieval snow. Fear of the supernatural was not confined to churches or tales. It was woven into daily survival. The stories that saved yet. Stories were not only warnings, they were lifelines. Around fires, families told tales of knights who braved winters worse than theirs, of saints who endured hunger through prayer, of villagers who triumphed over wolves, spirits, and storms. These tales were more than entertainment. They were medicine for the mind. To hear that others had endured was to believe one might endure as well. Children drifted to sleep dreaming of heroes. Adults listened and quietly reminded themselves, if they survived, perhaps we can too. The minds in the beasts of winter. In the medieval world, animals were more than companions or laborers. They were survival itself, providers of food, warmth, strength, and even light. And in winter, their fate was bound tightly to that of humans. If the animals lived, the people lived. If they perished, families faced ruin. The November choice. Winter survival began with a hard decision each November: which animals would live and which must die. For peasants, keeping every beast through the cold was impossible. Each one required fodder, shelter, and care, and hay could not stretch to all. So families culled their herds. Chickens and pigs were slaughtered in greatest numbers, their meat salted or smoked to last through the season. Cattle were spared when possible, for they provided milk and strength for plowing. Sheep were valued for wool, goats for milk and their hardy nature. Horses, precious for labor and transport, were preserved at all costs. It was a grim but necessary calculation. Better to feed fewer animals well than to watch all starve slowly in the snow. The barn in winter. Those animals that remained were brought close, often into barns attached to homes, or even into the cottage itself. Straw was piled thick on the floors, not only for bedding, but for insulation. The warmth of cows and goats, though slight, could make the difference between unbearable cold and survivable chill. At night, families slept with the muffled sounds of beasts nearby, the shifting of hooves, the lowing of cattle, the cluck of hens. The smell was strong, but the warmth was priceless. The line between human and animal blurred, both species enduring winter side by side. Feeding the beasts food for animals was as precious as food for people. Hay, stacked in lofts and barns, was carefully rationed. Oats or barley might be fed sparingly to horses. Cattle gnawed on dried stalks. Goats picked at whatever brush could be cut from frozen hedgerows. When fodder ran short, desperation set in. Some families cut branches and stripped bark for goats. Others boiled straw into mash, hoping it would sustain life a little longer. A starving animal was a warning bell. It meant hunger would soon echo at the human table as well. The silent partnership animals gave more than meat. Cows, even in winter, sometimes offered milk, turned into butter or cheese that extended food stores. Chickens, though fewer in eggs during the dark season, still provided occasional nourishment. Sheep's wool, spun through the long nights, became garments that protected human skin from frost. Even their dung had purpose. Dried, it could be burned as fuel. Spread on fields after the thaw, it would prepare the soil for spring planting. Nothing was wasted. Every creature was part of a cycle of survival. The perils of winter. But the beasts were as vulnerable as their masters. Frostbite could claim hooves and ears. Illness spread quickly in close quarters where dampness gathered. Wolves prowled the edges of villages, sometimes dragging off sheep or goats left unattended. When an animal died, grief struck hard. It was not only the loss of a creature, but of milk, of wool, of plowing power, of the hope of future generations. A dead cow could mean a family's ruin. Children wept openly for lost animals. Adults mourned silently, their sorrow sharpened by the knowledge that survival had just grown harder. The spiritual bond. In the medieval mind, animals were woven into the order of God's creation. Churches blessed cattle and horses, prayed for flocks, and reminded villagers that beasts, too, bore divine purpose. Saints were invoked for their protection. Saint Blaise for cattle, Saint Anthony for pigs. Stories told of miraculous animals that spoke in human tongues, of oxen kneeling in adoration at the manger of Christ, of birds singing hymns at dawn. Such tales blurred lines between beast and man, making their partnership in survival feel sacred. Even in ordinary life, gratitude was offered. A farmer might pat the neck of his ox after a hard pull, murmur thanks to a goat for its milk, or stroke a dog's fur for guarding the door at night. These gestures were small, but they reflected a truth. Animals were not expendable tools. They were fellow travelers through winter's cruelty. The dog at the door. Among all beasts, dogs held a special place in winter survival. They guarded the threshold, warning of wolves or strangers. They shared scraps of food, curled close for warmth, and barked into the night when silence grew uneasy. A loyal dog was more than an animal. It was a sentinel, a companion, a protector against both beasts and spirits. The mutual endurance. Thus, winter was not endured by humans alone. Barns and cottages alike were filled with the sounds and smells of shared struggle. People tended animals with care, and in return, animals gave what they could: milk, wool, eggs, labor, warmth. It was a silent partnership, forged not in words but in necessity. To survive, humans and beasts alike bowed beneath the same frost, listened to the same howls in the night, dreamed of the same spring sun. In the medieval winter, survival was never solitary. It was a chorus of breath, human and animal alike, rising together against the cold. Winter behind stone walls. When people imagine the medieval winter, they often picture peasants huddled in huts, suffering in silence. Yet cold and hunger crept into the great halls of lords and ladies as well. The castle walls might be higher, the food richer, the fires grander, but winter still pressed hard against stone. The castle's cold. A castle was a fortress built for defense, not comfort. Its thick stone walls held out invaders, but they also held in dampness. Drafts seeped through cracks, slipping beneath tapestries and around shutters. Great halls blazed with enormous fires, logs stacked taller than a man, flames leaping high into chimneys, and yet only those nearest the hearth felt real warmth. Step a few paces away, and breath still fogged in the air. Servants hurried constantly to feed fires, dragging wood through icy courtyards. The smell of smoke clung to every garment, every tapestry, every curl of hair. Bedrooms were no warmer. Nobles slept beneath heavy layers, linen sheets, wool blankets, and fur coverlets piled high. Bed curtains were drawn tight to trap breath and body heat. Even then, water froze in pitchers left overnight, and frost sometimes crept across the inside of windows. The food of nobility. Yet nobles suffered less from hunger. Their stores were fuller, their larders stocked with salted venison, smoked boar, barrels of fish, wheels of cheese, sacks of grain, and imported luxuries like figs, almonds, and spices. Winter was a time of feasting. Roasted meats turned on spits, stews simmered with onions and garlic, bread was served fresh from ovens fueled by endless wood. Ale, wine, and mead flowed freely, mulled with cinnamon and cloves to warm the body. Banquets broke the monotony, filling halls with music, laughter, and the glitter of candlelight on silver goblets. Jugglers, musicians, and storytellers entertained guests as tables groaned under food that peasants could only dream of. But even abundance had limits. By late winter, the quality of food declined. Fresh fruits and vegetables were gone, replaced by shriveled stores. Meat became saltier, bread grew harder, and even nobles tired of the endless repetition. Luxury softened the blow, but winter still dulled appetite and spirit. The life of servants. Behind the grandeur was labor. Servants bore the heaviest burden of keeping castles alive in winter. They rose before dawn, tending fires, scrubbing floors. Theirs was a life of exhaustion in freezing corridors where fires never reached. Cooks sweated in smoky kitchens, surrounded by cauldrons and spits. their faces flushed while their feet froze on damp stones. Stable boys mucked stalls in barns where horses steamed in the cold, their hands raw from rope and frost. For these workers, noble privilege was a distant flame. They endured the same cold as peasants, only within higher walls. The pastimes of lords and ladies. Winter leisure belonged to the highborn. When hunts were impossible, nobles turned to indoor diversions. They played chess, dice, and card-like games. They listened to poetry, commissioned musicians, or read romances aloud in candlelit chambers. Embroidery and weaving filled long hours for noblewomen, their needles stitching scenes of saints and hunts onto rich cloth, survival of the body but of the spirit. Nobles' celebration of power. Even in hardship, the Lord's Hall was bright, abundant, untouchable. Fear within the fortress, but cold stone could not keep out all threats. Disease found its way into castles as easily as cottages. Servants carried fevers. Nobles fell ill despite wealth. Physicians prescribed spiced wine, warm baths, or charms against the plague. But cures were limited. Superstition haunted noble halls as well. Strange noises in drafty chambers became whispers of ghosts. The howls of wolves outside were taken as omens. Dreams were studied for meaning. Candles were lit in chapels to ward off spirits. Nobility and peasantry alike shared the same fears, though cloaked in finer robes. The bond between high and low. Though nobles and peasants lived worlds apart, winter drew their fates together. A failed harvest affected everyone. Fewer rents paid, fewer animals tithed, fewer supplies for manors. If peasants starved, lords' tables would eventually thin. In good years, nobles extended charity, distributing food and alms to the poorest. This was not only generosity but strategy. Loyalty was strongest when bellies were filled. In bad years, charity grew thin, resentment grew sharp, and murmurs of unrest simmered beneath the frost. The noble winter. For lords and ladies, winter was endured with more comfort, more color, more song. Yet, behind the wealth lay the same truth faced by peasants. Cold gnawed, hunger lurked, illness stalked, and fear whispered in every draft. Stone walls gave safety but not immunity. A castle was warmer, fuller, brighter, but still it was a place of survival, where even kings watched the snow and longed for spring. In winter, the distance between high and low narrowed. All humanity bent beneath the same season, humbled by the same frost. The thaw and the memory. At last, the grip of winter loosened. Snow softened into slush, rivers cracked and ran free, fields re-emerged from beneath their white shroud. After months of silence, the land found its voice again. Birds returned, streams bubbled, and the first green shoots pushed through mud. For the medieval world, spring was not just a season. It was resurrection. The first green. The earliest plants to emerge were not luxuries, but lifelines. Nettles, sorrel, and dandelion greens appeared, gathered eagerly by weary hands. These bitter leaves, boiled into soups, carried the freshness of life itself. After months of salted meat and dried bread, their taste was sharp and almost shocking. Soon after came peas and beans, the first vegetables that truly restored nourishment. Lambing season filled pastures with new life, milk returned to tables, Butter churns turned again. Slowly, meals grew richer, bellies fuller, strength returned. Each bite was more than food. It was triumph over death. The work of renewal. But spring was no holiday. Survival was only the first step. Now came the work of rebuilding. Fields had to be plowed and seeded, oxen driven, and tools sharpened. Winter-damaged fences were mended, roofs patched, and barns cleaned. Firewood supplies, nearly depleted, needed to be replenished for the next cold. Men rose early and worked late, pushing weary bodies back into rhythm. Women planted gardens, tended animals, brewed. The first frost. Imagine the year is 1312. The harvest has been gathered, the fields stripped of their bounty. Stalks of wheat stand as ragged stubble, orchards are bare, and the last apples sit in storage bins, bruised and softening by the day. Autumn's gold is gone, and winter waits at the door. The first frost settles like a warning across the medieval village. By dawn, the ground is hard, brittle beneath worn leather boots. Smoke rises from crooked chimneys as families test their stores and brace for the months ahead. They know what is coming: cold, hunger, and darkness. Yet, in a world without central heating, without supermarkets, without the comforts of modern life, they have no choice but to endure. The cold that crept. Winter was not an enemy that struck all at once. It crept in slowly, testing the unprepared. The thatched cottages, patched with straw and clay, were built to survive the seasons but not to comfort their inhabitants. Gaps in walls let in bitter drafts, and snow blew through roof cracks to scatter across dirt floors. Inside, fires were the heart of survival. Families crowded around the hearth, the only true source of warmth. Yet wood was not infinite. Every log burned meant another hour of warmth, another pot of food cooked, but also another piece of the winter supply gone. Children scavenged in nearby woods for twigs and branches, while fathers split logs with frost-stiffened axes. To run out of fuel in February was as deadly as running out of food. The darkness of days. Winter shortened the daylight to a few pale hours. Dawn came late and dusk arrived early, pressing villagers into long stretches of darkness. By candlelight or rush lamp they worked, mending clothes, weaving wool, carving tools, or preparing food. Shadows danced on rough wooden walls and the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and damp straw. The darkness was not only physical, but psychological. In an age when superstition ran deep, villagers believed that winter nights carried dangers beyond wolves. Ghosts, demons, and restless spirits were thought to wander when the nights grew longest. To survive meant not only battling cold, but keeping fear at bay. The stores of autumn preparation determined survival. In September and October, food was gathered, salted, smoked, or dried. Barrels of salted fish, hams hanging from rafters, sacks of grain stacked against walls. These were the treasures of a medieval household. Yet, for all the labor, supplies were never abundant. A poor harvest meant a lean winter, and many families faced the season knowing they would not have enough. Bread, the staple of life, was rationed carefully. Children were given small loaves. Adults tightened their belts. Meat, when it appeared, was reserved for feast days or the sick. Grain spoiled. Rats invaded storage bins. Salted meat turned rancid. Each loss was felt with sharp despair, for there was no replacing it. Hunger was not an accident in medieval winter. It was expected. The question was only whether a family could endure until spring. The clothing of survival. Against the cold, clothing was the second defense after fire. Wool was the fabric of the age, spun, woven, and layered. Children wore hand-me-downs patched a dozen times, their sleeves too short, their tunics too thin. Adults wrapped themselves in cloaks and hoods, stitched from sheepskin or lined with fur when possible. Shoes, made of leather, stiffened with frost. Many went barefoot within their homes, the cold earth numbing their feet as they huddled near the fire. Gloves were rare, and hands cracked and bled from exposure. The wind cut through clothing, and no amount of layering could fully stop its bite. The first weeks, the early weeks of winter, were deceptive. Families still had bread in their bins, salted meat in their barrels, and firewood stacked high. Children played in snowdrifts, laughing as they shaped icy figures. Adults sang songs at night, reminding one another that Christmas was near. Yet, beneath the merriment lay quiet fear. Everyone knew the stores would dwindle. The real test was not December, but February and March, when hunger gnawed sharpest and supplies turned to dust. The first frost was only the prologue. The true story of winter survival was still to come. The shadow of memory. Every medieval winter was haunted by memory. Families recalled the terrible freezes of past years, the neighbors lost to illness, the children buried beneath hard earth before the thaw. The stories of famine years passed down like cautionary tales. Of winters when bread was baked with acorn flour, when whole villages scattered in search of food, when wolves prowled boldly into streets. As the first frost glittered across fields and rooftops, villagers prayed that this year would be merciful. But mercy was rare in the medieval winter. More often, the season was a trial, one that weighed on body and spirit alike. And so, as December began, the people of the Middle Ages tightened their belts, stoked their fires, and stepped into the darkness. What lay ahead would test them all. The deep winter. By late January, the medieval winter revealed its cruelest face. The days were shorter than ever, the nights unbearably long, and the cold no longer felt like weather, but like a living enemy pressing in from every side. The first stores of grain were gone, the salted meat nearly consumed, and families began to taste the sharp edge of want. The howl of the storm. Blizzards tore across fields, winds shrieking like demons in the night. Snow piled high against cottages, blocking doors and windows. Villagers sometimes woke to find themselves trapped inside, forced to dig their way out with frozen hands. Travel became nearly impossible. Roads vanished beneath drifts, rivers froze solid, and carts sat idle. Even nearby villages might as well have been on the other side of the world. Winter isolated communities, leaving them to survive or perish on their own. Inside cottages, storms were endured with silence. Families sat by fading fires, listening to the wind batter shutters, praying the roof would hold. The storm was a reminder. Nature was in command, and humanity was small. The hunger begins. This was when the hunger became sharpest. Meals shrank to near nothing. A thin broth of cabbage and leeks might serve as dinner. Bread slices were halved, then halved again. Some families counted grains of barley, measuring survival in handfuls. The poor suffered most. Beggars roamed from door to door, pleading for scraps, often turned away by neighbors who had none to give. For widows, orphans, and the elderly, winter was merciless. Many simply did not survive. Famine loomed like a shadow. Everyone knew its signs: cheeks hollowing, energy fading, tempers growing short. It was not just lack of food. It was the slow surrender of the body to starvation. The threat of wolves' winter also drove beasts closer to human settlements. Wolves, gaunt and desperate, prowled the edges of villages. Their howls carried on frozen air, chilling families huddled by the fire. At night, livestock had to be guarded carefully. A single breach in a barn door could mean the loss of sheep or goats. Children were warned not to wander alone, for a hungry wolf would not hesitate. Stories grew around these predators. Some saw them as omens, devils in disguise, or punishments from God. To kill a wolf was a victory, but to hear their cries at night was a reminder of nature's relentless hunger, echoing humanity's own. The weariness of spirits. As the cold deepened, so too did despair. Work was hard to find. Fields lay dormant, construction ceased, and the daily rhythm slowed. Too much time was spent waiting, watching the fire, counting dwindling stores. Boredom gnawed as sharply as hunger. Men grew irritable, arguments broke out, children cried, and silence hung heavy. Villagers told stories to keep spirits alive. Tales of saints, of ancient heroes, of winters survived in ages past. Songs were sung not for joy but for endurance, each note a reminder that voices still had strength. Faith offered solace. Priests urged endurance, framing hunger as holy suffering. Sermons spoke of Christ's own fasting, of paradise awaiting those who endured. Religion gave meaning to misery, but even faith was tested in the endless dark. The cold inside. What fire could not warm, cold claimed. Fingers split and bled, joints ached, and breath turned every surface damp with frost. In many cottages, ice rimmed the walls inside, creeping along beams and shutters. Clothing was patched and repatched until it barely held together. Children, wrapped in blankets, sat motionless, conserving heat. Even in noble halls, tapestries failed to block drafts. The great stone castles were cold chambers, their grandeur no shield against nature's reach. To sleep was to retreat into a cocoon of furs, cloaks, and blankets. Yet even then, the cold seeped in. Water left by the bed froze overnight. Those who slept too deeply risked not waking, their bodies numbed into stillness. The burden of survival. Every decision mattered. Burn too much wood today, and tomorrow would be colder. Eat too much bread tonight, and next week would be hungrier. Survival was a calculation, measured by handfuls of grain and stacks of logs. Mothers carried the heaviest weight, dividing food between hungry mouths, hiding their own hunger so their children might eat. Fathers braved the frozen woods for more fuel, their beards crusted with ice. Children learned quickly to accept less, to endure silence, to swallow hunger with patience. Winter was not only physical, it was moral. To hoard was tempting, but to share meant trust. Villages survived as webs of interdependence, yet selfishness always lurked. When famine grew sharp, even the bonds of community could fray. the depth of darkness. By the end of January, the people of the Middle Ages were in winter's deepest valley. The cold was at its fiercest, the nights longest, the food scarcest, and hope thinnest. Every day endured was a small miracle, but the road ahead stretched bleak and uncertain, and still they pressed on. For though despair whispered in every draft, there remained the faint promise of survival. They had seen winters before. They would see winters again. But the cruelest truth of all was this: the hardest months were still to come.